and gentlemen,
Can I please have your attention? Can you dig it?
Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. I am I'm a little sort of nervous, giddy this morning because rather than do what we normally do, which is try to cram Friedrich von Hayek nerdery in at the margins and seams of other conversations, we decided to do a frontal assault on the topic this morning, and we literally have I use literally only modestly figuratively the Pope of Hayekian nerdery. We have Bruce Caldwell. He's the director of the Center for the History of Political Economy, and as well as a research professor of economics at Duke University. He is also the general editor of the collected works of Friedrich Hayek, and he is working on a 2-volume biography, full biography of Friedrich Hayek. He already wrote an intellectual biography of Hayek in 2004, and the first volume of his 2-volume history or biography of Hayek has come out, and it's called Hayek: A Life. I'll allow Professor Caldwell to pronounce the first name of his co-author on this.
Hans-Jörg Klausinger.
Hans-Jörg Klausinger, who's a German speaker, is the co-author, and the second volume is going to come out any day now, I am sure. Professor Caldwell, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
I'm delighted to be here and cannot wait. A full Monty Hayek session. I love it.
Normally, my standard go-to question for authors, because it's the question I always like to get when I'm on a book tour, is what's your book about? But since we now know that your book is about Friedrich Hayek, why don't we start with sort of like, when you account, not someone who doesn't know anything, right? But like somebody who's modestly educated, has heard of Hayek, but really doesn't understand what the big deal is. How would you answer them the question, who was Friedrich Hayek?
Sure. So Friedrich Hayek is a famous 20th century economist. He was born in Vienna. If you look at the cover of the book, it is a picture of a man with a tie on in lederhosen in the Alps somewhere, or some sort of mountain scene. And I think it captures him in the sense that his roots are very much in Austria, but he moved in the 30s to England, and during the tumult of the 1930s became a British citizen. So he's actually described as an Austrian-born British economist, typically, and he stayed there until 1950 when he moved to the University of Chicago. He was at Chicago for 12 years to 62, and then moved back to Europe. He lived in Germany for a while, and then Austria, and then back in Germany. So his life was really a 20th century life, and he's an economist who wrote in areas well outside of economics as well, so made lots of different other sorts of contributions. You said that I wrote an intellectual biography earlier. That book would be Hayek's Challenge, and although it is very much an intellectual biography, it's not a full intellectual biography in that it focuses mostly on his contributions to the strange subfield of economic methodology. So this is one of the many areas to which he contributed: economics, political theory, psychology, a book called The Sensory Order. So he wrote in lots of different areas. And I think one reason why he's such an intriguing figure is, first of all, he knew almost everyone who was famous. He was at the right place at the right time. He was in England when Keynes was doing the general theory, and he was one of his chief opponents. As the welfare state was developing, he was a chief opponent of that. Some of the people who wrote books that helped create the welfare state, Lord Beveridge and his Beveridge Report in England, he was the director of the LSE where Hayek was teaching. Hayek went to the University of Chicago around the time that the Chicago School of Economics was forming. So he's just a really great person to look at his biography, but also see the development of economics in the 20th century. And what's wonderful about it is he always took a contrary view in virtually all of the major developments within economics and also within just politics in general. His was generally a minority view, and he was sanguine about that. He understood it, but he was a person who continued to articulate his views. So I've been working on him for many years. This first volume one of the biography, my co-author and I worked on it for about a decade, just because there's so much rich stuff to try to find out. And I think it's fair to tell the readers or listeners who may potentially be readers that the reason it took 10 years was that we took a very deep dive into all sorts of archival and family documents, but also we wanted very much to tell a full story, not only about his ideas but about his life. And his life was also interesting, as it turns out. So it was it's been a fun ride so far, and now we have volume 2, which it's not going to be out tomorrow, but it's not going to take us 10 years because we've done a lot of the background research that's necessary for both volumes.
Right, and so this book basically ends around the road to serfdom's publication.
Actually, right? It ends in 1950 when he's making his decision to move and finally finalized his contract to move to the University of Chicago. So it picks up. Volume 2 picks up with his years at the University of Chicago, where he was on the Committee on Social Thought, which itself a very interesting institution at the university.
Okay, so and I'm going to apologize to listeners in advance. I'm going to try and ask questions and elucidate things to help the layman understand, but there are going to be times where I'm just going to fall into sort of second or third order Hayek geekdom, and I just hope listeners can play along. First of all, just a very sort of just quick factual question: when did he learn English? Like, did he always speak English? What other languages did he know?
Some students at the LSE said when he was lecturing that they couldn't tell whether he was speaking English in a German accent or German in an English accent. So it was a long a long process for people who have heard interviews of him. There are a number of them online. He did a long series of autobiographical interviews in the late 70s after he'd won the Nobel Prize, interviewed by a lot of great people from Robert Bork to Jim Buchanan, lots of prominent folks. So he came to America on a visit when he was in his early 20s. This was in 1923 and 24. And he apparently took a Berlitz class to try to quickly learn English then. He had to study English on kind of on his own, as well as any modern language, because the gymnasium or high school that he went to, the kind of training that they had was in ancient languages like Greek and Latin. So when you read his stuff, you'll see lots of references to Greek and Latin, which is perplexing to a modern reader, but that's the training that he had. So he picked it up on his own. He spoke a lot of languages. He fought on the Italian front and picked up some Italian during World War I. He picked up French. I'm not sure where. He always said that he wasn't very confident in his French, but certainly in his move to London, initially, as I told you the story about the students, there were other stories about people having a hard time following him, but they could clearly see that he was a brilliant mind and had done some brilliant work in monetary theory, and that's why they offered him a job at the London School of Economics.
But he didn't pick up Hungarian when he was in the Austro-Hungarian Empire or anything, did he?
So I don't think so. His father, there's correspondence during the First World War where Fritz, which is what his family called him, was kind of bored because they were on a line that was a fixed line that just was maintained over a period of months and months. And it was the separating, what separated the two sides was this wide malaria infested river, and neither side wanted to make a push. The Austrians were happy to have taken, he had just missed an initiative in which the Austrians advanced their lines quite a bit. Having advanced their lines, they could live off the countryside, and they were quite happy with that. And the Italians just didn't want to go get driven any further back, so they had been reinforced by the British, and it was just kind of a stagnant line. And so he was bored, and his father said, look, you ought to do what I'm doing. Yeah, brush up on languages. We both like botany. See if you can find any specimens. So his father was giving him instruction on how to use his time more fruitfully. Typical father-son relation.
The only reason I asked about the Hungarian is as my dad had this theory that Hungarians, particularly Hungarian Jews, so because Hungarian Jews would grow up learning Hebrew and Yiddish, but also Hungarian, and Hungarian being like the hardest language in the universe. All other languages sound like baby talk compared to Hungarian, and it makes it very easy for them to learn. And so, he wasn't Jewish, but Eric von Knut-Ledeen, who was a writer for National Review, he spoke like 14 languages, and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, so, as you know, Hayek wrote this essay, I think it was in the Chicago Law Review, Intellectuals and Socialism.
Yes.
And a big part of his argument was the importance of intellectuals to spread ideas. He says the rise of socialism would have been impossible without essentially the intellectuals being sort of laying the groundwork for it, and which, Irving Kristol, lots of people made similar points. But he called intellectuals professional secondhand dealers in ideas. What did Hayek consider himself? Did he consider himself first and foremost an economist, an intellectual, a philosopher, and where would you classify him?
So I think that what his goal was, let me give you the background to that paper, and I think it will help me answer that question. Great question. So the Mont Pelerin Society has its first meeting, its founding meeting in 1947. This is a meeting of people who are concerned about the direction of the post-war world. All of them are people who embrace what we would call today classical liberal ideas, although they disagreed about the details. And they also disagreed about what the Mont Pelerin Society should be. Hayek's view was that it was a place to have conversations among people who were like-minded but who might disagree, to try to iron out the foundations and philosophical principles that would underlie a liberalism that could be viable and attractive in the 20th century. This is a period when liberalism is it may have been at its nadir in the 30s. The fact that the Cold War was about to begin may have made it somewhat more attractive in 1947, but it was still a view that was, he felt that he knew a few people in each country who were among the intellectuals who would have sympathy with these views, and that's why he decided to have this organization. Now, some of the other people at the meeting and in subsequent meetings, next couple of meetings, said, no, what we need to do is to get out there and get our views known to the wider public, that we should be the secondhand dealers in ideas for liberal thought. Hayek was adamant that he rejected that view. He said, our goal is to formulate the ideas and argue them out amongst ourselves, so that we get to something that may be a consensus view, but at least a view that we can articulate, and then others will get it out there. So this was actually written initially and sent to some of the people who were the foundation people who were helping to fund the meeting. It was the Volcker Fund was the one that helped fund the American participants in that first meeting. And there was someone who was a affiliated not directly with the Volcker Fund, but he had his finger in every pot, actually, in terms of the foundation's name, Loren Red Miller. And he had met with Miller, and we show in the book that soon after meeting with him, in his notes, he's starting to sketch out this argument that appeared in the Intellectuals in Socialism. And subsequently, we found correspondence between Hayek and Dick Ware, who was at the Earhart Foundation later, who said this particular article really became a very important article for us in terms of trying to figure out what we were doing as a foundation and trying to promote classical liberal ideas. And I think it's a long answer to your question. I don't think he would characterize himself as an intellectual, although I think most people would look at him and not knowing the way he's making that particular distinction and say, yeah, this is definitely an intellectual, because he's writing books in all sorts of areas within economics and then well outside his field, and influential books. Every one of them in various ways had either had or should have had an influence. That was what he was doing with that article anyway. He was saying, let's think about that. And I mentioned foundations. You think about things like the Institute of Economic Affairs in London and other think tanks around the world at this point. All of them are kind of picking up on articulating. So maybe some of them are the secondhand dealers in ideas, but you have to have ideas before you deal them. And so his bailiwick was trying to figure out the ideas and giving them a strong foundation.
And so would you call him primarily, if you had to pick a label, economist, intellectual, or philosopher, which one would you apply to him?
That's a great question. I call him a social theorist. That's what I've called him before. And I think that covers it, because he did take a theoretical approach to all of the things that he tried to analyze. He viewed himself as a scientist, even when he's if you take a look at The Sensory Order, his book on psychology, it's done in a scientific manner. It's one of his most difficult books, and certainly his economics is that way. So I'd say a social theorist. Yeah.
So let's try to clear out some low-hanging fruit here. When people say the Austrian school, what do we mean and who is in it?
Yes. So that first book that I mentioned, Hayek's Challenge, the first third of it or so is actually about the Austrian School of Economics. So Hayek came out of a tradition that originated in Austria. People who know a little bit about the history of economics know that what we today call microeconomics had its origins in the 1870s, the simultaneous discovery of what's called the marginal principle. Don't worry about that if you don't know about it. But it was occurring in Lausanne, Switzerland, in Austria with Karl Menger, William Stanley Jevons in England. And this transformed classical economics into what might be called later neoclassical economics. So the Austrian school was part of this transition to a new way of thinking about economics. Out of this came things like, in England, Alfred Marshall's supply and demand curves. So this is where supply and demand curves being drawn that everyone who's taken economics either loved or hated, but certainly remembered, came out of this revolution. So the Austrian school came out of that tradition, but it was also different from the others. Each one of these schools had their own particular emphasis. And in Austria, they ended up being in opposition to other ideas and schools that were emerging. Within economics, their opponents were the German historical school. So the Austrians tended to be more theoretical rather than historical in their approach to understanding social phenomena. They ultimately came also up against positivists. So the positivist within philosophy movement is something perhaps we don't need to go into, but certainly was one of the things that they reacted against. And finally, socialism and Marxism. And within Austria, this was called Austro-Marxism. One of the interesting things about the early school is that the generation, so if Karl Menger is the first generation Austrian economist, his successor would have been Friedrich Wieser, who was Hayek's teacher, and Eugen von Bamberg. Bamberg ran a seminar that had a wonderful cast of characters in it, including people who are famous even now in the pantheon of economists. Joseph Schumpeter participated, Ludwig von Mises, but also Otto Neurath, who was a positivist philosopher of science and socialist, as well as some of the leading people who went on to lead Red Vienna in the 1920s, people who were academics who came into the government in the immediate post-war period. So it's a rich history. The Austrian school is defined by an interest in capital theory, in subjectivism, in its approach to economic topics, and as opponents of socialism. And even Ludwig von Mises most famously had an article and then a book that was critical of socialism in the early 1920s. And Hayek carried on that debate when he got to England with various English socialists at the London School of Economics.
So I seem to recall that the reason it became called the Austrian school was, like so many of these things, it began as a pejorative from the German historicists, right?
Precisely.
And the German historicists, speaking in broad brushstrokes, were of a school very influential on American progressives, but were believed in this sort of subjectivity or relativism of historical context, right? We actually get the word empathy from a German word from the historicists. And the way I always took it was that what they thought was pejorative about the Austrian school was that it was more universal in its approach to economics, which said that there are laws that don't just apply to Germany, but that apply to human beings in economic activity everywhere. Is that wrong? Is that epistemological difference not part of it?
That's very much part of it. So the German Empire was among German-speaking lands was academically the people in charge in the late 1800s, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, I mean, they had beaten it in a war. They were kind of a backwater intellectually. So just to the origin of the Austrian school, if a German is saying, well, asked, a German professor in the German historical school is asked, well, what do you think about what they're doing in Vienna? You could just imagine the person throwing their hands and saying, "Oh, that's Austrian economics." Okay, so that's the sense in which it was used. So what were the differences? Well, the Austrians, both of them rejected the classical school. Okay, the approach of a labor theory of value that came out of Adam Smith and Ricardo and was picked up by Marx, in fact, and so they said the Austrians said, well, we still think there's a theoretical approach to be taken, and that's our marginalism. The German historical school said, look, the British used this approach to argue for free trade when the British Empire was the only game in town, the one that really controlled the seas. And what we think is the policies that people should embrace, that countries should embrace, should take into account their local situation, who their trading partners are, what the morals of the country are. We have to have a really precise understanding of all of that before we can say what policies are the appropriate policies for a particular country. So they didn't want to go along with free trade. They were critics of free trade. They called this Manchesterismus, because this is where the free traders in England were associated with the Corn Law League and et cetera. And so they were critical of any theoretical approach that was supposed to be universal. Now, there's a nice illustration of a rebuke of the sort that would be possible for that kind of view. It's said that one of the marginalists was visiting one of his friends who disagreed with this and said, "Look, is there a place in town where I can get something to eat?" He said, "Oh, there's lots of places in town. A place where I can get a free lunch." And the guy said, "I'm sorry. What do you mean? Do you need some money?" He says, "Well, no. I'm just illustrating the laws of economics. There aren't any places where you can go and get a free lunch." And so there are some basic things that are most people's assessment of what was called the Methodenstreit, the debate over methods that took place between the German historical school and the Austrian school at the end of the century, as a waste of intellectual energy, because both knowledge of institutions and particular specifics of a particular country are important, but there are also general principles which if you try to make policy and don't understand them, it's a recipe for the sorts of disastrous policies that are everywhere in evidence throughout history.
Let me test out a theory. I'm always nervous when I have very strong opinions that then actually be tested against experts. But I've had this riff about Hayek for a very long time. I get why the Hayek-Keynes debate fascinates a lot of economists. It all reads like witchcraft to me. I mean, I basically I'm on Team Hayek, obviously. Similarly with what was it, the price calculation debate that von Mises and all those guys. Interesting stuff, but it seems to me that the most interesting debate in some ways of the 20th century, and again, it's a figurative debate because I don't think that they actually had much interaction with each other, is sort of symbolically between Hayek and John Dewey. And the argument I would make is that Dewey, better than almost anybody else, represents the cult of the expert. This idea that the individual can amass enough knowledge and expertise so as to outthink the market, outthink systems, and impose optimal policies down, right? It's sort of Politburo thinking. And it infected so much of the progressive movement in the United States. And Hayek represents and really articulates the opposite point of view, which is that no individual can reliably outthink the market, that there are things that come through the price mechanism and things like the price mechanism that you don't know, you can't even know how much knowledge is in prices. There's just so much knowledge in it, right? You don't know all the factors that are going into it. And that's why why open, fair, competitive systems are more important than trying to impose results. And it seems to me that those two worldviews, broadly defined, really sort of in both strident and modest forms, define most of the intellectual, political and economic conflicts of the 20th century. What say you, sir?
I hate to disappoint you if you're looking for an argument, but I agree with you completely. The abuse and decline of reason project was something that Hayek began as he saw World War II getting ready to begin, and it was going to be his war effort. He didn't ever finish it, but that was something that the Road to Serfdom was part of it. So he did finish parts of it. But this was prompted by him having had three intellectual experiences. First, he grew up in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then in Austria in the post-war period as a student of Austrian economics as opposed to the German historical school. The German historical school were conservative imperialists, nationalists, and they were just trying to catch the German Empire up with the other empires that existed out there. In 1923 and 24, Hayek goes to the United States, New York, and he studies with Wesley Clair Mitchell. And as you said earlier, a lot of American progressives, where they got their intellectual ammunition from was from American academics going over to Germany in the 1880s, 1890s, and studying with the German Historical School and coming back and transferring some of these ideas to the United States within a new context. Okay, so these are American progressives. These are not German imperialists, but they share a certain view about what could be done by the state and what the role of the state, the appropriate role of the state, and what state experts, the German Historical School said, look, we're going to support the German Empire, and we need to have lots and lots and lots of students doing these research projects because they're also going to fill up the bureaucracy in the empire. He gets to England in the 30s, and it's the Fabian socialists, and they have you've got progressives, you got socialists, you got conservatives. Something they all shared was what Hayek came to call scientism, the view that you can scientifically shape society, shape the institutions of society, intervene in markets and other areas of society on a scientific basis. So just leave it to the experts. They're going to reform things. They're going to build a better world. And depending on which country you were in, the world that they thought is a better world was a very different world. But they all had the same kind of worldview as to what was possible. And I think what you were identifying there very, very nicely, I must say, was the contrast between these two worldviews. Hayek was quite pessimistic about the ability of planners to be able to accomplish this. And his particular targets in the 1930s in Britain were the socialists. But he understood that this was a phenomenon that went well beyond socialism. So the socialist calculation debate was, as you said, this is a debate among professional economists, and it becomes quite technical at times. And certainly the debate with Keynes, if you read their books, a treatise on money and prices and production, and contrast them, I mean, you could spend a lot of time and not get very far with those books because they're models without any mathematics, and so they're very difficult to read. But the worldviews that were behind those two debates and the debates that went forward are the sorts of things that you identified in the prologue to your question.
Yeah, I mean, I always tell people that in a lot of ways, Road to Serfdom may have been Hayek's most important book in terms of political significance and cultural significance. But it's not the book I would recommend if you're going to read one book by Friedrich Hayek. I wouldn't say read The Road to Serfdom. I would say, I always tell people, constitutional liberty is a big bite to chew. But I always tell people, if you want to sort of get it, it's Fatal Conceit. And I know among hardcore Hayek types, there are problems with that book, but like for the layman who wants to just sort of to be able to understand the sort of broad brushstroke ideas, I think it's the best one. I mean, I'd be curious to know if you disagree. But on the Road to Serfdom, one of the reasons why I don't say people should read that if they're only going to read one book is that I think Road to Serfdom's fine. I generally agree with it, but I read it in good faith, right? So I'm not talking about the caricature of the book. And I agree with Russ Roberts that it should be that it's prophecy. But people forget that prophecy isn't necessarily prediction. Prophecy is a warning, right? My namesake Jonah says, get your act together, Nineveh, or you're going to have a problem. It doesn't say no matter what you do, you're going to have a problem, right? Prophecy is a way to warn people how to get right with God or right with history or right with it, whatever. And that was sort of what Hayek was trying to do there in a polemical fashion. Where do you come down on the Road to Serfdom? Was he more right than wrong, more wrong than right? Did he ever have any regrets about writing the book, not because of what he actually wrote, but because of the way it was sort of turned into an accusation of crackpottery? I mean, where do you come down on the whole chapter of his life?
Yeah, so he wrote the book during World War II, And he was afraid that England, in particular, which was his initial audience, was going to go down the road of socialism in the post-war. And he had good reason to fear that. And in fact, the British Labour Party won in a landslide in the post-war period and began a series of nationalizations, kind of hit the high point of their nationalizations in 1948 and then kind of backed off a bit, but very much going in the direction of a welfare state. And he was worried about that direction. But he wrote it as a liberal, not as a conservative. And one of the first things that he noticed, both in England and then when it was published, an American edition was published 6 months later in the United States, that it was being embraced by people who would self-identify, I think, as conservatives, and it was vilified by people who would be on the progressive left wing. And so it quickly became a caricature, and the idea that it was making a prediction that if you have a little bit of government, your additional government, you're going to end up in a totalitarian state. And as you said, it was a warning. It was a warning. He said it's setting up tendencies that are difficult to reverse as they go along, and they can have very bad consequences. So his initial feeling was that it may have been misinterpreted by lots of people, but this was the immediate post-war period. It was a politically contentious time. And when I say he was writing as a liberal, if you take a look at that first chapter of the book, it's the abandoned road, and the abandoned road is the road of liberalism. And you said that the book that you like is The Constitution of Liberty. I like that book very much too, because some of the reaction to The Road to Serfdom was, well, okay, this is a good criticism of what you don't want to see happening. The limitations of a setup that is socialistic. But what's your vision? What's your vision of the alternative? And that's what he's trying to articulate, as you say, in the Constitution of Liberty. So I wouldn't back off from saying to people when you recommend a book by Hayek that would be a good one. I would also say that for those who have had any economics, The Use of Knowledge in Society is a wonderful piece. It tries to lay out just how a well-functioning price mechanism can allow us to share information. It's a marvelous invention that was never invented. It just emerged. So it's an example of a spontaneous order that emerges when you have the right institutional constraints in place that allow social cooperation on a vast scale. It's the theoretical underpinnings of Bastiat's wonderful phrase, Paris gets fed. Yeah, no one plans to feed Paris. There's no person who says, I'm going to feed Paris. Millions of people every day, day in and day out, coordinate their behavior in such a way that indeed Paris gets fed, as do millions of other cities.
So that's a good actually, let me ask you this very quickly on that. Can you explain why Hayek was so interested in English common law? I mean, a friend of mine was saying how he had seen an interview where he was trying to try to find what was lacking in the field of economics in terms of understanding how certain principles emerge naturally, and that's why he got attracted to English common law. Is that right? And can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so he trained as a lawyer. Okay, that was what his first degree was in, and that was the way that economics was taught at the turn of the century in German speaking areas. The fields had not become siloized, as it were, in the way that they are today. So he had a legal background, and my speculation, my hypothesis on all this is that we talked about the market as a spontaneous order. He also did his book on psychology, and he viewed the workings of the brain as creating an order. So you've got the gazillions of neuronal connections, just like you have millions of people cooperating in feeding Paris, you've got millions or billions actually, of neuronal connections that are creating what we call consciousness. I mean, these neurons are not trying to create consciousness, but it's creating this larger order that allows us to have the experiences that we do. And he wrote that book was writing it in the late 40s, published in early 50s. And he's working on the Constitution of Liberty. He's looking at the various things that emerged through time in various countries that contributed to a liberal regime, looking at the American founding, looking at traditions that emerged in France and England, and in fact in Germany. And I think he started to recognize the common law as another kind of example of something that is no one is planning it. It's not like legislation that is specifically designed to address a particular issue. It's something that by precedent over time emerges, and it emerges in a way that can be. He recognized that sometimes it can go off in the wrong directions. He's not saying whatever emerges is good. He certainly was not saying that. That it could be corrected, and in many instances should be corrected through legislation. Slavery was gotten rid of. It was something that emerged, but his confidence that that there are certain areas in which orders emerge that can create great advantages for the population. I think that was at the basis of his increasing attention to the common law as you get into the 60s and 70s. You see it mostly in law, legislation, and liberty than you do in Constitution of Liberty.
So, all right, this one might go over the heads of some listeners, but so in the early chapters of the Constitution of Liberty, Hayek basically is sort of I'll be careful about the adjectives before the word utilitarian, but he's a utilitarian of a certain order, and that he says his recommendations for the means of society are pretty much the same as ends, whatever works. And he says that he likes religious tradition, but his basic test for religious tradition is basically just whatever traditions survive over time, in effect. And it's those passages, like in a couple different essays, including When Virtue Loses All Her Loveliness, which is just a fascinating essay by Irving Kristol, that it hurts me. It makes me feel like my parents are getting divorced when Irving Kristol and Friedrich Hayek fight, because I love them both so much. But he basically calls Hayek just an abject moral relativist there. Was Hayek a moral relativist? Does he have a vision of the higher good, or is it simply his vision of the higher good is a procedural one more than a sort of theological or ethical one?
So Hayek's epilogue to the Constitution of Liberty is why I'm not a conservative.
Mm-hmm. We're going to talk about that. Trust me. Go on.
If you look at his personal lifestyle, he was a conservative. I mean, he had a very traditional sort of approach to things. He was, if Roger Scruton wants to emphasize the importance of beauty, he had a great appreciation of beauty. I've spent the last 2 weeks reading his diary from his trip to duplicate John Stuart Mill's trip in 1854 and 1855 through Greece, Italy, and France, and looking at all of the monuments and reacting to them. So he had a sense of beauty. He was a cultivated European, and he loved the mountains. The one reason we put the picture of him in Lederhosen on the cover of the book was that as soon as the semester was over, wherever he was teaching, he would go back to where he had started out when he was 9 and 10 and 11 years old, to the mountains of Austria, to stay for 2 or 3 months to recharge his batteries. He's very, very traditional sort of person. I think even though he went through a divorce, I think it was a wrenching experience. He was not one of these academics who, if you read the personal histories of lots of people who were contemporaries, they were horrible in terms of their womanizing sorts of behaviors and all sorts of things. So he was somebody who made a mistake early on, tried to fix it, and it caused a lot of heartache when he got his divorce to marry his childhood sweetheart, as it were. But I mean, other than that sort of thing, he was someone who I think who had the same sorts of values that are being articulated by people who call him a moral relativist. Okay, but he's also somebody who is trying to articulate a liberal vision of society, and a liberal vision of society is one that does not say this is the way, that these are the certain sets of values that you must have. There are certain values that you have to have, liberal values, but when it comes down to specific ways of living one's life, he didn't want to articulate that. That's just as a personal way of approaching things. And when you're talking about the Constitution of Liberty, he says right in the introduction, he says, "Look, I think liberty is an important and perhaps a supreme value, but I'm going to take a more, as you would have, he didn't use this word, but as you put it, a more utilitarian approach. First of all, because he's an economist, and that's what economists do. They're looking at what are the most effective ways of organizing various policy alternatives. But he said, I don't want to say that liberty is the foundation of what I'm arguing for here, because I'm trying to convince people who are opponents, who don't agree with me. And if you're arguing with people who don't agree with you, you don't start as a starting premise the basis of your argument." So he says that right up front. I think that needs to be read carefully when people are judging him. But he is not. I mean, this is. The fusionist movement was taking place in the 50s. This was always a tension, continues to be a tension to today, between the liberal worldview and what might be characterized as a social conservative worldview. And I think it's I think it is often a fruitful conversation for both sides to have, but there are certain fundamental difficulties there with
okay, so I'm going to
make a mix.
I'm going to push back on a couple different fronts, and you can decide.
Excellent.
You can decide which one you want to swap back at me on. So, and we're going to get to why I'm not a conservative, because I hold a lot of paper on that one. So, first of all, particularly as you bring up fusionism, I'm a big part of those debates on the right, and I'm a Frank Meyer guy. I've written a lot about Frank Meyer. I wrote the preface to the latest edition of the What is Conservatism book that ISI puts out about the fusionist debate, all that stuff. And all right, so my first objection is that I think in your characterization, I'm not saying what you actually believe, just how you articulated it just now, but also Hayekian types in general and liberals in general, and we listeners should know by now that when we're talking about liberal, we're talking about the sort of classical liberal sense of liberal, and not necessarily as a synonym for progressive or whatever, or left-winger. That liberals do themselves an enormous disservice when they buy into the premises of whether it's social conservatives or serious left-wing types, when they frame liberalism as a system of neutral procedure, because it is not. Take it out of the context of economics for 2 seconds. I mean, I can do it in the case of economics too, but it's just easier in the case of law. There are a bunch of people on the right now who want to say that conservative legalism, federalist society, original understanding stuff is bad because it's procedurally it's value neutral. It's just proceduralism. To which I say, nonsense. The right to, and this is a Hayekian argument, right? I think the Hayekian process of trial and error and emergent order and all of that doesn't just yield efficacious utilitarian institutions. It yields superior moral institutions. So the whole idea that murder is evil and wrong, that emerges through trial and error. There was a lot of murder in the evolutionary record until society realized we really just should have a blanket rule: no murder, particularly no killing without a trial. Right? The right to confront your accuser in a trial. Yeah, that's proceduralism. It's also a highly moral precept. The right to not incriminate yourself, the right to worship as you please, to say what you please. These are not simply neutral things. And just because Hayek can make a case that they're the best way on practical empirical grounds for organizing society does not mean that they are not also the most moral ways for organizing society. And the fact that everybody agrees now that murder is wrong, or that rape is wrong, or that even persecuting people for their religious beliefs is wrong. These were really hard-won lessons over the course of human history, and they are embedded in liberalism, so much so that they've become dogmatically accepted by everybody, and we've lost sight of the fact that these are actually hard-won moral victories. The second place I'd push back a little bit is and this stems from years of fighting. I'm in much better standing with my libertarian friends now than I was 20 years ago, but the whole why I am not a conservative thing. Milton Friedman, God bless him, used to quote the title of that essay. Lots of people quote the title of that essay as if they think it is dispositive of a major question. And yet, if you actually read the essay, which was originally intended as a talk to slap down Russell Kirk at the Mont Pelerin Society, he was arguing against a European style of conservatism that lionized the past above all other things, that was sort of shot through with nostalgia, which is what Robert Nisbet would call the rust of memory,
and with claims to the natural law, and with a hierarchical, justification of hierarchy that you're exactly right. That is the sort of conservatism he was opposing, and which does not well describe what you might favor.
Right. And so he argues in that essay, which I quote all of the time, that he says that in America is one of the only places in the world where you can be a defender of liberty and call yourself a conservative, because we are trying to conserve a fundamentally liberal revolution. And he says, if I have to come up with a label for myself, it is old Whig, which is exactly what Edmund Burke, the father of Anglo-American conservative, called himself. So it vexes me sometimes. I'm not saying you're doing it. I'm just saying that this is one of these things where I feel like I have to fight this fight quite often.
I accept your claims there completely. And yeah, just factually, exactly right. That he was worried that a specific variant of conservatism that existed in Europe was going to be imported to the United States, and so yes, I take your point on that completely.
Yeah, and so on the fusionism side, the Meyer position, which I think I've gotten wrong in the past and have come around to, was, he never, it's sort of like the Austrian school thing. He never coined the phrase fusionist. That was coined by Brent Bozell, who was a critic, right? It's almost so many of these labels, like neoconservative was originally an ad hominem. It's like a lot of these labels come from critics, and then the way you sort of show that you've arrived is you own them. And but Meyer's argument was less that we need to fuse these two things together, or that it's a political strategy with a three-legged stool and all that kind of thing, and more of this tension is inherent in Western civilization and in American civilization. And I don't think Hayek would disagree with that.
I just taught a class with a wonderful young philosopher on liberalism and its critics, and we read Meyer, and I think that his vision is one that Hayek would be quite comfortable with. And just as you say, it was the vision that came out of Kirk, and I think he also he came to have kind of a dislike of William F. Buckley, as it turns out, as well. because he thought that Buckley was just being too flip, which of course he was. I mean, he's a very entertaining guy, but thought of him. I think he probably thought of him as in the same way that he thought of Galbraith, as people who've got a lot of public attention, who are just provocateurs and provoking in ways that are not helpful in terms of trying to get at serious issues. So yes, but someone like Meyer, when I read his essay, I thought, yeah, this guy's reasonable, and I think Hayek would agree with him. And just let me reinforce for your listeners your point that at the very beginning of Why I'm Not a Conservative, that he said in America, conservatives are people who are basically trying to preserve that liberal tradition. So quite right. American conservatives are different ball of wax.
So I have he wrote an essay called Why I'm Not a Conservative, thrown in my face a lot by people over the years, and I always make the argument I just made to one extent or another, but then I also will point out Hayek also didn't like the term libertarian either. So what are you talking about? Why was he not a libertarian? Why didn't he like it?
So in correspondence, he was somewhat dismissive of people like Rothbard, for example.
We should explain that Murray Rothbard was a brilliant crank. Some people emphasize the crank more than other people, but like he had cranky tendencies at the very least, I think it's fair to say.
Right. And I think I would just say that he's not an anarcho-capitalist or anarcho-libertarian or anything like that. He believed that there is a role for government, at the very minimum, to protect property rights. Just the standard stuff that comes out of the liberal tradition, that you can't have a society if you don't have minimal protections in place for people to be able to do something when somebody violates a contract or tries to impose force or coerce one person coercing another. So the sorts of things that are articulated, I think, very well in the Constitution of Liberty is that you do need a government, and it's not government. He actually goes so far as to say it's not the size of government as much as it is what sorts of constraints are placed on government. You can have the government, for example, offer certain goods for sale as long as they don't say we're the only ones who can offer them for sale, and that others are able to compete on equal terms against them. So he was probably further left in terms of if we want to use that left-right distinction, which is such a horrible one, but further left than many regular libertarians might be, certainly, and other people who might otherwise agree with the Austrian school more generally. If you wanted to look at a spectrum, you could go Rothbard and then von Mises and then Hayek. There's lots of distinctions within the Austrian school as well.
All right, so this is sort of a sociology inside baseball question that I'm just honestly curious about, and I don't know if many other people will be. How was it, in your estimation, that, and this is more about von Mises than it was about Hayek, but there was this, where did this come from in the 80s and into the 90s of this sort of truly weird, some racism at the fringe, overlap between von Misesian libertarianism and sort of Ron Paul, all the way over to, there's this whole, there's the Lou Rockwell crowd, which is one of the reasons why I was in bad odor with libertarians for a while, is because I picked the fights with the wrong kinds of libertarians. But how is it that one of the most fundamentally anti-racist political philosophies could have been co-opted the way it was in certain corners by, if not outright racist, then sort of racist sympathetic types who were being too clever by half? Where did that come from?
That's a great question, and I don't have an answer for it. I just know that the people that I came to know within the Austrian camp were the anti-racist, real liberals that that we respect, whose ideas we respect. And you wouldn't see that sort of thing in Mises. I don't see how that could be gotten out of von Mises. But it is the case that you have to, I think, do a bit of a network analysis and take a look at specific individuals who ended up being important within that movement, who had these views. But I sometimes tell the story. I was invited to a Mises Institute summer camp. I'd never been before. I appreciated the Mises Institute website, still do, has lots of literature on it that is useful. It's a great go-to site for that. And it turned out that Pete Boettke was at the same meeting. And, there's this antagonism between George Mason and I think NYU versus Mises Institute that plays out in terms of the actual players in the movement, a movement of which I'm an historian. But I haven't gotten to that period, and I don't know how important that will be in telling Hayek's story, actually. So I may not be dealing with it. But to return to my personal anecdote, I found the meeting to be very strange, and never went back. And some of there was at one point a dinner where I think Ralph Raico was talking, and then either something that he said or through the question and answer period, some really disturbing stuff was said. And kind of simultaneously, Pete and I just stood up and walked out without any signal to each other. We just were both appalled at what was being said. And I don't have a direct memory of exactly what was said, but it was appalling in the way that you indicate. Yep. So, and they, there was another episode where Pete was on a panel, and they were talking about Ludwig Lockmann, who is someone who was sometimes described as the German Austrian. So he's somebody from Germany who was affiliated with the Austrian movement, had been a student of Hayek's in the 30s at LSE, went to South Africa. And when I first started to learn about the Austrians is when I went to NYU in 1981-82. And at that time, Lockmann was coming from South Africa every spring. I got to know him quite well. We had meetings once a week. And so at this Mises Institute meeting, someone, I think, Pete just mentioned, and Lockmann said, and there was a bronze cheer done by Hans Hermann Hoppe at the mention of the word Lockmann, the name Lockmann. Just outrageous behavior, childlike, outrageous behavior. I mean, these are people who are true intellects, like Lockmann, being razzed by midgets. So it's a sad thing, and I don't know how it happened. I really don't know how it happened. And in some ways, I'm not interested, except that it does put a black stain on people who are responsible liberals, who then get tarred with that by people who are critics.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems to me like in the realm of oxymoronic positions, libertarians for slavery is pretty high up there.
Pretty tough to square that, sir.
Okay, so in the little bit of time we got left, I thank you for indulging me on this stuff. Question I get, I hear a lot of people wondering is, and I agree with you, like knowledge problem, the knowledge problem, the uses of knowledge in society essay is probably the single most name checked thing on this podcast, or it's certainly up there. And often it's because there are a lot of people, there's this whole group of people on the right who seem to think that, like, when we used to say experts and economic planners can't outthink the market, aren't smarter than the market, they seem to think there was some asterisk in there that said, yeah, but if social conservatives are in charge, they can. And there are a bunch of people on the right who are into, industrial policy now.
Yeah, that's bizarre to me.
Yeah. And so I guess the question I have for you, though, is I reject it entirely when it comes to the idea that somehow socially conservative economic planners are going to be better than socially liberal economic planners. But what about artificial intelligence? What do you think does that do to what does that do to the whole knowledge problem thing? If AI can, in fact, with chat and PT, whatever that thing is called, there are these things now that seem to be able to sort of, as you were talking about the sensory order argument about the billions of neurons, if you have billions of computer chips in effect, does that mean that the old argument no longer applies?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think one answer is you can never say never. Or you should never say never, that it can't work. I have to say that this kind of question has come up through the course of my now almost 40 years of studying Hayek, where people said, well, we've got computers now. Longa was saying in 1967, now we just feed it all into a supercomputer. They thought they were going to try something like that in Chile. It didn't pan out under Allende. People later would say, well, what about computable general equilibrium models? We can do it with these things. And then there was claims that it could be done with other advances with neuroeconomics, where we could just put electrodes in people's heads and be able to figure out what they. So, I mean, my one commonsensical response is, why don't you just find a township somewhere and try it out? Just give us a proof of concept. You find some leftist place and just give it a try. Just let's have a planned society. We'll do that. But yeah, I think that's one response that is actually probably the appropriate response. But in terms of the technical stuff, I think it's an interesting question. I think one of the things that would be very difficult, I think that what we've got currently, at least, is the ability, if tastes and preferences don't change, to deliver things very quickly, and perhaps shape people's tapes and preferences through what we show them. The AI procedures that are ubiquitous on these social media platforms that are generating, we now know this person completely. Here are the ads that are going to really trip his or her trigger. But it's the emergence of new things that I wonder if AI can handle. I mean, who's creating what? Chat. What's it called?
Chatbot NPT. I can never remember how you call it. Whatever it's called.
It has to be based on something.
There's definitely the garbage in, garbage out problem.
Yeah, there's a reflexivity thing there that I think is difficult. So I mean, never say never, but to what effect? And this is in the realm of a technical set of arguments. It does ignore the liberty thing, which is, I think, an important. It will increasingly become an important component of such discussions.
Yeah, so it's really funny that you bring up the why don't you just take a little township and give it a try thing, because this is actually my response to a lot of the new nationalist, post-liberal industrial policy types, the ones who want to have sort of this, the politics needs to be about the pursuit of the Aristotelian highest good, and it needs to be Catholic and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, okay, look, you might be right, but why is your political project setting its sights on imposing this on 330 million Americans who are not going to vote for it? Why not just try it in Rhode Island, right? You could probably get the numbers together to influence public policy, and the people who want to live that way can live there. That's what the whole point of federalism is. But they don't like it because it exposes and illuminates that a lot of this stuff is really about power and not actually about the ideas.
Yeah, I mean, who decides? Who decides? That always has to be the question.
And that's a big part of that is. I mean, at AI we're having all these internal conversations about what does small r republicanism mean as opposite from liberalism. And it's a fascinating conversation, and I don't want to give away other people's goods on this, but there is nothing inherent to liberalism as Hayek understood it, or as anybody understood it, that said you can't have very traditionally bound local communities that are allowed to make their own mistakes so long as you respect basic fundamental rights, and have the right to exit, but go be Amish, be my guest, but don't tell the other 329 million people to be Amish too if they don't want to be. And people hate hearing that, because there is something in our lizard brains that says, no, people aren't allowed to live wrong. And I have to be in charge of making sure that people live right. And I do think there's a conception of living right. It's sort of, we were talking about, these hard-earned lessons of liberalism about murder and fair trials and all the rest. There are a lot of those lessons, but beyond them, knock yourself out. Do what you want to do. All right. So last couple quick questions. I know I don't want to give the listeners any spoilers about the second volume of your biography, but Hayek did in fact pass away in 1992. How compos mentis was, and I don't mean this with any disrespect, it would be such a tragedy given who he was not to see the Berlin Wall fall and understand it and see the fall of communism. And how did he process that stuff at the time? And was he up to speed to have a full appreciation of it? And did he have an optimistic reaction or a pessimistic one?
Yeah, good question. So I'm sure he knew about the fall, but the last 7 years of his life, so basically from 85 to 92, he stopped traveling. He just stayed at home in Freiburg. Sometimes went to the mountain retreats that they would go to in the summer. So he was not able to get out, and he had a hard time working, writing. He still did a few things, but he did understand that it was happening for sure. He just couldn't participate because he physically was unable to travel. So the fact that no one heard much from him didn't mean that he wasn't still around. And he was there was actually a rather a strange and very, very depressing book that was written by his secretary, Charlotte Cubitt. She kept a daily diary, and then created this book out of her diary. And so much of it in the last 70 years is just all the miserable ways that your body can fall apart, basically. So it's not that his mind was gone, but his body was not doing well.
And lastly, was he a happy man?
That's a great question. He was a social person. He enjoyed society, but he was also somebody who didn't have very many close friends by his own admission. He numbered them 3. But I think, most people who met him in kind of casual things, like where you'd be at a conference, he would engage. He enjoyed intellectual engagement. I don't think he was a small talker. Okay, so he's not somebody who did that, but he really enjoyed the academic life. So I think of him as kind of a very a pure intellect in that regard. You were asked whether he's intellectual. He's somebody who for whom intellectual pursuits really tripped his trigger. And I think if he was at a conference where people were talking about stuff, particularly his own ideas, he would have been very engaged and very happy. Within his own personal life, he did come into conflict with his birth family over politics because they were in Austria and Germany while he was in London. And
they were more nationalist and somewhat anti-Semitic and all that, right?
Yeah, they had. Well, his mother was certainly anti-Semitic. His father was kind of. He was in a German medical association that had an Aryan paragraph, but I mean, it was also, as we try to show in the book, you have to understand the times in which they were living and the environment in which they were living. This was not at all unusual, unfortunately, for various professional organizations to have these things at the time. But he always he went his own way. So he's very independent in that ways. And I think to the extent that independence is a sign of happiness, he did get to do what he thought was important in his life in terms of his pursuits. He had occasional periods of depression, so certainly he wasn't happy during those times. But then he snapped out of them. He used to have this joke. I tried old age and I didn't like it. So now I'm back. So I mean, it's I think we'll try to round out our picture of him more in the second part of his life. He was not happy in his first marriage, but he was. There was also he was happy with his. I think he's loved his children. Certainly, his daughter Christine, he had a good relationship, if sometimes fraught, because she was independent too, and she wasn't particularly happy with with his decision making vis-a-vis her mother. So there we go.
Bruce Caldwell, thank you so much for doing this. The book is Hayek, A Life, and you can get it everywhere. I'm actually going to, because it plays so perfectly to type, be taking it on a trip to the Caribbean shortly. And I'm very excited.
It's a heavy book to carry around.
It's all right. We'll manage. And thank you so much for doing this. And when the second, if not beforehand, when the second volume comes out, we definitely would love to have you back.
Oh, that would be lovely. Thank you so much for this, Jonah. I've enjoyed it immensely.
Okay, so Bruce Caldwell has left the studio. My apologies to friends and other Hayek geeks out there who have, I no doubt, some burning question about Hayek that I did not get to or that we did not discuss. There's just a lot to cover, and I probably should have done a little bit more about the guy's life story. By the way, Jim Pethokoukis, my colleague at the American Enterprise Institute, sometimes guest on this podcast, he did an interview with Bruce that gets more into his life story stuff. You can find it through either Ricochet or the AI website. And I had that in my head, so I wanted to get at some of the stuff I was holding paper on for so long. But it's supposed to be truly a wonderful book, and I was not joking when I said I have a vacation planned in the Caribbean with some friends, and I'm gonna bring it. I should, I kept wondering where I should stop and say, okay, let's explain that. And because there are some things that I think people are like, what are they talking about? Who is von Mises? All this kind of stuff. And maybe I got to have Continuity back on here, and we'll just do another Conservatism 101 thing. But one point just sort of that I kept wanting to get into and didn't, and Hayek writes about this explicitly. I can't remember where. I'm sure it's in more than one place. Part of the way to understand Hayek's project is that Hayek came from a cultural, for want of a less grandiose term, milieu, where aristocracy, monarchy, empire were either still live propositions or very recent propositions. The ideas defending them, all of that kind of thing. Also, the rise of nationalism, as Bruce mentioned, was very live at the time, and of course socialism. And the thing that Hayek stressed is that liberalism, when it first emerged, was a spirit of rebellion and liberty and liberation from monarchy. Right? It was the enemy of monarchy, and it was the enemy of statism and authoritarianism. First the philosophes versus the ancien regime in France, and then the philosophes who were, again, speaking in broad terms, the liberals who were in tension with Napoleon, the liberals like Locke and Smith who were in tension with monarchy. Even Burke, to a certain extent, had his tensions certainly with absolutism, right? He certainly believed in the monarchy, but he also believed in the power of institutions in balance with each other in society. But liberalism was the hot thing, the cool thing, the fun thing, the smart thing, the freedom-loving thing. And it sort of defined the left for a good chunk of time. And then with the rise of socialism as a doctrine and as a movement, all of a sudden liberalism gets denounced as a right-wing thing, in part because liberalism had been so successful in making societies more liberal than they had ever been, right? Maybe not as liberal as some would like, or certainly some today would like, but liberalism had been ascended. Manchester liberalism, free trade, economic liberty, democracy, these things had been surging for a while. And one of the quote unquote downsides to it, I think it was an upside, was that you started to get a lot of rich people who weren't aristocrats. And so it was seen as, liberalism was seen to some extent as this doctrine or ideology that defended the economic ruling classes, which were considered a new economic aristocracy, which was a common way of framing things. And that made liberalism seem right-wing, defending reaction, defending the powers that be, defending the status quo. And the new hotness, the new cool thing, the new rebellious thing was to be socialist. And this is one of the things that drove Hayek crazy. And I don't mean crazy. I just mean it was a great source of tension and motivation in his writing, is that this bothered him a great deal, because he considered defending liberalism to still be the cool thing, the smart thing, the exciting thing, the thing that's on the side of progress. And the fact that it got shoved over in contemporary debates as a right-wing thing instead of a left-wing thing did not change his point of view about that at all. And that's one of my inspirations for my understanding of what conservatism is that, I don't just mean the conservative temperament. I mean, Anglo-American conservatism, which is deeply informed by liberalism, is that it doesn't matter whether it's popular or unpopular, whether it's in power or out of power, fashionable or unfashionable. It's good and it's true. And it's sometimes it's more fun to be defending it when it's unpopular and out of power than when it's popular and in power. And but that's one of the great things about Hayek. That's one of the things I think is important to understand about Hayek, is that he stayed consistent in his defense of liberalism rightly understood, regardless of where it placed him in various contemporary ideological or political debates. And that's sort of one of the ideas of this podcast called The Remnant, is that it sort of has a similar, that you should have a similar outlook, and that, fads come and go, opinions come and go, popular sentiments come and go, but there's some things that are enduringly true and worth defending. And this idea, liberalism doesn't count all, it doesn't exhaust all of the things that are worth defending, but it's an important component of them. And anyway, I just thought I should get that out there. I didn't want to use up his time making that point. And so with that, thanks everybody for listening. This is pretty much the last week of David French being a full-time employee of the Dispatch, which is sort of heartbreaking. Thank you so much to all the positive feedback I got about my G-File about Portland and my solo podcast about Portland. More about that another time. And I'll see you next time.
No, you won't. This is a podcast.